Healing from COVID-19, achieving better mental health through policy interventions. The pandemic generated unprecedented psychological and emotional stress, which has rapidly increased the prevalence of global mental health disorders, such as anxiety and depression. The COVID-19 outbreak has forced millions to stay physically isolated and uncertain about their future. During the pandemic, treating mental illnesses became a back-burner priority for an overwhelmed healthcare system, leading to disruptions in mental health treatment and community services for those who need it the most. Recent estimates reveal that the pandemic disrupted critical mental health services in 93% of countries worldwide. Government policy responses to these unprecedented mental health challenges varied greatly depending on a number of factors such as availability of funding and resources, accessibility to mental health services, and prevalence of social stigma against mental illness. One pandemic later, we asked the question, how are we doing on mental health? In this podcast, we will explore the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on people's mental health and shed light on a number of evidence-based and robust policy interventions through which the UAE can ensure better mental health for the public. However, before we embark on this journey, it's crucial to clarify what mental health is, since the way we define a concept directly dictates the solution we can reach. For the purpose of this podcast, we will borrow from the World Health Organization's definition, which defines mental health as a state of well-being in which every individual realizes his or her own potential, can cope with normal stresses of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to her or his community. When we examine mental health under a holistic lens, such as the one in this definition, it becomes easy to observe the different ways the pandemic has negatively affected individuals and their mental health. For example, fear of virus transmission, whether the fear of getting infected and becoming very ill, or infecting loved ones, has been one of the main drivers that shaped the public's reactions, especially in the early stages of the pandemic. This has facilitated the development of psychiatric symptoms such as depression, confusion, stress, and anxiety, even among individuals who have never previously experienced mental illness. Lockdowns or intermittent periods of home confinements were used as policy responses to curb infection rates by many countries around the world. While lockdowns have an expiry date, their impact on people's mental and emotional well-being can linger, and experts are still trying to understand the long-term effects of this on different generations. Adding to that, the economic aspect of the pandemic and its impact on people's livelihood has complicated things because a large number of individuals have experienced financial losses and unemployment, which might have further escalated emotional problems. Mental health challenges are further complicated by social stigma, which makes it difficult for people with mental health disorders to seek help or cope with them, leaving many to feelings of isolation, discrimination, and despair. Mental illness can impede the individual's potential. There is a growing international recognition of the seriousness of mental health problems on global health, economy, and sustainable development. Many of these concerns have been reported globally, with some experts sounding the alarm to a looming mental health crisis. When it comes to global trends, the UAE is not an exception. Therefore, implications for policy making in this context is crucial, especially for preparing for future pandemics or emergencies. So the main question to tackle here is, how can the UAE ensure better mental health for its population? There are a number of policy recommendations that can be explored to promote better mental health for the nation as it heals from COVID-19 pandemic. The first recommendation is focused on the utilization of telemental health. Telemental health is a branch of telemedicine, which is the use of medical information exchanged from one site to another via electronic communications to improve patients' health status. The pandemic has accelerated the adoption of digital modes of healthcare delivery around the world, and the UAE was one of the countries that welcomed that shift, especially during lockdowns when mobility was restricted. This process was made possible by the UAE's strong digital infrastructure. The mental health care sector can benefit from the flexibility that telemedicine offers. In places where telemental health is delivered, we find evidence on how it helped solving policy challenges like shortage of mental health providers and social stigma associated with mental illness. However, there are certain downsides policymakers should take into account. First, there should always be a serious consideration for cyber threats, where patients' records and privacy can suffer from security breaches or misuse. Second, if there are no strong regulations, tele-mental health can invite opportunities for unprofessional or unethical practices. At the same time, however, if regulations are over-restricting, this can slow the pace of tele-mental health services and by that defeating its purpose. The second recommendation for policymakers is to align mental health care regulations across emirates and entities. Different regulatory bodies, with each having a separate process and a set of guidelines and requirements, currently manage regulations and licensure requirements in the UAE. It is imperative to address the challenges in the regulatory system to overcome issues such as shortage of service providers. One way to address it is to have a unified licensing procedure that facilitates licensing and hiring of professionals. While regulations are an essential step for ensuring healthcare quality, bureaucracies and paperwork should not weigh down practitioners and service providers. Taking into account that the private sector in the UAE is the largest provider of mental health care services, regulations can also incentivize private clinics to take an active role in community service. With the right incentives, the private sector can benefit from a range of government offers and services, such as reduced fees or partial tax exemption, in return for increased engagement in community-based measures. The third and final recommendation addresses the social stigma around mental illness. Promoting mental health does not happen exclusively in policy circles. It is deeply rooted in communities' perspective and beliefs regarding mental illness. Raising public awareness is fundamental to battle social stigma. This requires measuring and assessing public perception of mental illness, a process that can aid policymakers in better understanding barriers to policy implementation. Promoting realistic and relatable images of mental illness can shift public perspectives and attitudes to mental health. The pandemic presents an opportunity to normalize mental health challenges and create a platform where human rights and dignity are protected, where people can come forward and seek help when needed without feeling stigmatized. In conclusion, the COVID-19 pandemic has disrupted the familiar and introduced various health, economic, and societal challenges. However, through the right policy responses and interventions, nations can extract many opportunities to build momentum for positive change for the future, ensuring emotionally and mentally resilient communities.